Bright and awake. I'm going to tell you a little story about a place in old Boston called the Old South Church. Now, the Old South Church, during the 1700s, was the tallest and largest building in all of Boston. Now it sits quietly nestled among the towering skyscrapers of busy urban life. But in 1746, during what came to be known as King George's War, it was the tallest and largest building in Boston. And in 1746, the colonists got word that the French had sent nearly 100 ships to come and burn the coastal cities of America. The colonists were quite concerned because they didn't have the cannons and the guns and the manpower and the armament that they needed to hold off this large French armada. So they turned to the only weapon they had, a weapon they had to turn to quite often. The governor of Massachusetts declared a universal day of fasting and prayer. On the appointed day, the colonists in Boston gathered together at the Old South Church. Standing room only, people gathering on the outside, looking in through the windows and the doors. And it was Reverend Thomas Prince's turn to officiate at that high pulpit in the Old South Church. And he prayed before hundreds, "O God, we ask thee to raise thy right hand and scatter the ships of our tormentors and sink those proud frigates to the bottom of thy deep." He went on to pray like this for quite some time until all of a sudden the room began to darken and the shutters began to violently slam against the walls as if the very hand of God had shaken the earth. And the bell atop the tower of the old church began to ring erratically. Reverend Prince paused for a moment. He bowed his head. When he looked up, tears were streaming down his face. He raised his hands high above his head. "O God, we hear thee. We hear thy voice, O Lord, we hear it. Thy breath is upon the waters from the eastward. Thy bell tolls for the death of our enemies." Now, how did Reverend Prince know what was happening? He didn't have a cell phone. Okay, yeah, those ships are going down. He just felt like God was answering their prayers. And sure enough, about a week and a half later, the news came that a virtual hurricane had risen out of the Atlantic and had sunken nearly every one of those French ships. And those that remained limped back to the West Indies from whence they came. Boston wasn't burned. Charleston wasn't burned. New York wasn't burned. God had once again preserved the colonists from utter destruction. Isn't that a great story? Thank you for letting me share that with you this morning.
There, can you hear me on that? Have I got it turned on? Yes, no. Kimberly, will the red light be on? My husband is the brain of this operation. I am the most untechnical person, so forgive me for just a moment. And I would come stand out in front of there, but I need to be back here so that you won't see my knees shaking. And so I'm going to kind of hide back here. Now are we all recorded? There we are. Yes. Can you hear me now?
No.
No.
Rachel, can you give me your
We heard
pack?
that before.
Now you can't hear me.
No, it's hooked up to the... Sorry, we have a two-phone system here.
I feel like I'm hooked up to life support or something. These cords coming out of me.
Hold that for a second. Okay, sorry.
So microphone is on. Oh, that one's on?
Yes,
Oh,
so if
okay.
you use two, it might create feedback.
Okay,
So
would you
we're
want
going
to-
to,
you want to
if
stand
you're
right
going
here
to
the
be
whole
here,
I am going to be here.
then use this
Okay.
one.
All
Yeah,
right.
this one.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Mary King threw the strand of pearls on her bed, her eyes blazing with anger. My mother, my stupid, stupid mother. How could she do this to me? Tomorrow was her graduation from high school. Mary had been spending the time at the lake with her friends, and all her friends had told what their mothers had given them for graduation presents, and they were all waiting to hear what Mary's mother had brought. How could she face them and show them this old strand of beads? And that wasn't the worst of it. While her friends had been out shopping for new outfits, Mary's mother had insisted on hand sewing her a dress. It was plain and simple, and now she expected her to wear this old strand of beads with it. Mary was just humiliated. As she dressed for bed, she noticed over on the dresser there was an envelope. It was from Mr. Morse. Mr. Morse had been like a father to her. She and her mother had lived at Mr. Morse's house for as long as she could remember. He'd often given her gifts, so she thought, I bet there's a check in here at least. So she ripped it open, but there was no check inside, just a long letter. She sat down on her bed to read. Dear Mary, I had intended on giving you a check for your graduation, but it can wait. I was at the lake the other day, and I overheard you talking to your friends. I heard you say that you wished your mother's face was pretty and beautiful like your friends' mothers, instead of all red and cross-looking. You wished that your mother's hair was thick and curly like theirs, instead of thin and straggly. You felt embarrassed whenever you were with your mother out in public because when she walked, her foot dragged a little bit, and you always thought that people were staring at you. That's when I knew that more than a check, you needed a story. Mary rolled her eyes. Has everyone gone crazy, she thought, but she continued to read. Years ago, a young couple moved to our town. She was bright and had a bright, beautiful smile, and the husband was tall and handsome, and everyone instantly fell in love with them. They were obviously in love with each other, but being a small town, it didn't take long until we came to know their story. The husband was the son of a wealthy mill owner in a nearby city in eastern Pennsylvania. The dad had insisted that his son marry the daughter of a friend of another prominent and rich family, but the son had fallen in love with the girl that he thought was way beneath his station. When the son insisted on marrying this other girl, the father disowned him and said, if you marry her, I'm cutting you off, you'll never get another penny. Well, they were married and they moved to a nearby town not far away to start a new life. The husband had never had to work before, and so it was hard for him, but he took every job that came his way, and he labored hard, and she worked hard too. And bit by bit, they saved until they could build a little house on the hill, and they were very happy. And then one day there'd been an accident. The scaffolding the husband was standing on gave way, and he fell to the ground. His co-workers picked up his bleeding and bruised body and carried him home to that little house on the hill and laid him on the bed. That very night, a baby was born, a little baby girl. The husband fought with all he could to live for that girl, but the injuries were too severe, and he soon was gone, leaving the bride to herself. Word came from the father-in-law, who blamed the girl for taking his son away and said, give me the child. I will raise her as my own. She will lack for nothing. Only you must never see her again. The mother wrote back, I love her too much. I will find a way to take care of her. Well, she continued to work every job she could find. Eventually, she was given a job working as a teacher of young children at a school, and part of her pay was room and board. And again, they were very happy. And then one night, when the little girl was about 3 years old, the mother was downstairs in the living room reading when she heard a cry that struck terror in her heart. Fire! Fire in the west wing. That's where my baby is, she cried. She threw her book down, flew up the stairs, taking 2 and 3 steps at a time. As she reached the 3rd landing, smoke was curling down the hall. She dropped to her hands and her knees, and she felt her way through the smoke towards her little girl's room. Minutes passed, and then firefighters saw a figure emerge from the smoke. Her hands, her face, and her feet were badly burned. Her hair was gone, but in her arms she carried a bundle wrapped in a quilt, and from her hand dangled a strand of pearls. I'm badly injured, she whispered, but I have rescued my 2 greatest treasures. Please keep them safe for me. And she collapsed to the ground. For weeks, she writhed in agony. No one expected her to survive, but she was fighting to live for that little girl. As she started to heal, Word came again from the father-in-law. Send me the child. I will raise her as my own. She will lack for nothing. And again, word was sent back. I love her too much. I will find a way. Mr. Morse continued the letter. That's when I stepped in. I built a house in a city far enough away where I brought you and your mother to live with me all these years, somewhere that no one would know what had happened. I have watched your mother work with those hands that were so stiff and painful. She was working and saved every penny she could so that she could send you to college. Many a night I have walked by her room and found her kneeling on her knees, praying for strength to do what she needed to do. I've wanted to tell you these things for many years, but she made me promise I'd never tell you because she said it would kill her to have your pity. She only wanted you to love her for who she was. But when I heard you saying the things that you said about her at the lake, I could no longer stay silent. Now you must never let her know that I've told you these things. Sincerely, A.E. Morse. Mary sat in stunned silence on her bed, and then hot tears started to flow down her cheeks as the realization of all the sacrifices of her mother washed over her. All this time she thought it was Mr. Morse that was sending her to college, but no, it was her mother that was saving. All the time she was embarrassed of her mother because her mother wore the same dress everywhere. It's because she was saving every penny for Mary. Oh, how could I have been so selfish, she thought. Dear Lord, please forgive me. Now she heard her mother's footsteps coming down the hall towards her room. She knocked on the door. Mary, is everything all right? Remembering that she had promised she wouldn't let her mother know, she wiped the tears off her face. And she said, oh, come on in. Everything's okay. I guess it's just all the excitement of the graduation tomorrow. Mother, the pearls, they're beautiful. Have you had them long? Oh, yes. I've had them for many years. Your father gave them to me. He had to work so hard to earn them. I love every pearl on that strand. I saved them for you once in the long ago because I wanted you to have something that he had earned for us. He would be so proud of you. Mary couldn't speak. She just wrapped her arms around her mother and gently held her close for a long time. And then she whispered, truly, I have the most beautiful mother in all the world. I first heard that story probably over 50 years ago. I don't think I could have been more than 7 or 8 years old. But it left such an impression on me that for all these years, every time I saw a strand of pearls, I would think of this story. I remember the teacher who read it to us in Sunday school class. She read it from a little book. And that image was so clear that every time I see a little book of stories, I open it and I look for that story again. And for all these years, I could never find it again. Now, I'm going to come back to this story in a minute. But I want to tell you about the project that my husband and I have been working on. As the person who introduced me said, we raised 9 children. And as our youngest daughter was getting ready to leave home about 10 years ago, I had this really strong impression to create a small library of books for children that would fill them with hope. I had no idea what that meant. I didn't know anything about publishing books. I thought that was presumptuous to even think that I could make such a selection. But the feeling was such that I started looking around and I started moving forward. And shortly thereafter, I discovered that the books written before 1923 are in public domain, which means there's no copyright restrictions. And it also, I found that these books are gold. They are pure gold. This was a golden age of children's literature. And I started to gather these stories together. Now, these have been hidden in dusty old libraries for 100 years. It's only been in the last 5 or 10 years that they've come back to light so that we can use them again. When I first started doing it, I first put together a series of American history stories. I filled 12 volumes, and I called them the Freedom Series because the storytellers wove into the stories lessons to children on how to remain free. I learned things that I never knew before, and I was so anxious to get these into the hands of families, but I ran into a problem. How do you get the attention of children that are so, entertained, the flashy video games, that I found that it was hard to get them to want to read these older books. The language is a little bit harder to understand than they're used to. And yet I knew how much wisdom was in these books. How could I fill the gap? And I pondered this for several months. And then one day, I was visiting my mother out in Utah, and I was getting ready to go out to dinner, and I got to the front door, and I had this feeling that I can best describe as how you feel if somebody comes up to you and says, "Come here for just a second, I've got something I want to show you." That was the feeling. So I went downstairs, and I got on the computer, and I got on Internet Archive, where I spend most of my time, and I just said out loud, "I don't know what I'm looking for." And a keyword came to my mind that I typed in, and then a list of books came up that I started scrolling through. And as I scrolled through the books, there was one book that just kind of jumped out for some reason. It's not a particularly interesting title, but it was called The Use of Story in Religious Education by Margaret Eggleston. I opened it up, and as I started to read, I knew this was the answer I was looking for. 100 years ago, before I went to bed that night, I found out that 100 years ago there was a revival in the art of storytelling. And the reason they were doing it is because they were realizing that they needed to keep the hearts of their children warm. And that the way you do that is through stories and through storytelling. That's what opens the hearts of our children. And so I not only learned about storytelling, I started to learn about what they were teaching about how to warm and open the hearts of children. Well, as I started learning these things, opportunities started coming to me to be able to share what I was learning with others. And for some reason, I always started gravitating towards Margaret Eggleston stories. And I would tell stories such as this one. One day, Margaret had gone to visit a friend of hers, and when she walked in the front door, she could hear her little 6-year-old boy upstairs kicking and screaming and throwing things around the room. And Margaret said, "Do you think I could go up and see if I could do something to help?" And the mother said, "Well, he disobeyed one time too many, and he's been sent to his room without his supper. I don't think it will do any good, but you can try." So Margaret walked upstairs. John was in a heap on the floor by the foot of the bed. He didn't even look up at her, but she sat down on the floor, and she started to tell a story. She said, "You don't even have to listen if you don't want to. Long ago, away up in the far north, there was a little boy who had a sled. Now, he didn't pull this sled with a rope. Oh, no. He hitched it with 4 little dogs, and how they would fly over the snow." By now, John had stopped kicking, and he looked her direction. Slowly and carefully, Margaret unfolded the story of little Jimmy Standby of Labrador, who had stood by the dogs all through the night and through the day in the bitter cold because he had promised Dr. Grenfell he would stand by. As the story progressed, John crept slower, closer and closer to the storyteller until he had crawled up in her lap and was eagerly looking at her face to follow Jimmy to the very end of the story. When the story was over, Margaret got up to leave, and he said, "Please, will you ask my mom if I can just come downstairs for a minute? There's something I need to tell her." So after some coaxing, the mother agreed, and little John came down the stairs with his dirt-streaked red little face, walked right up to his mom and said, "She's just told me a really nice story, and I wanted you to know I'm going to have a name like his. I'm going to be Jimmy Standby too." And he walked upstairs like a man. There was another story that I often would tell. This was a story that she told. She was asked once if telling a story really can make a difference, and she answered the question with a story. She said that some years earlier, she had gone to teach a group of teenage boys, and there was one boy in there that was somewhat of a rebel, and she didn't even think that he was listening to the story. But this was the story that she told him. She said that there had been a young boy that had a job working in a bank. His job was to sweep up and to throw the trash out at the end of the day. And one day, as he was throwing the trash out, there was a large roll of money in the bottom of the trash can. He pulled it out, and he looked at it and held it in his hands. And he thought what this could do for him. His father was a drinker. He spent the money that he earned on drinking, and his mother was very ill. The doctor had said, if you cannot get medicine for your mother and get her out of the city, she could die by the fall. As he thought about all these things, he looked around. Nobody had seen him take the money. So he slipped it in his pants pocket, finished up his work, and started to head home. Along the way, the money felt really heavy in his pocket. So he took it out of his pants pocket and put it in his side jacket pocket. And then he took and moved it and put it in his inside jacket pocket. But the farther he walked, the more he knew he couldn't hold on to this money. And so he turned around and headed back to the bank. The security guard had to let him in. And he went straight to the office of the president, opened the door, threw the money across the desk, and explained to him how he had come by the money. The president looked surprised. He said, "Son, I know how much this money would mean to your family. Nobody knew you had it. Why did you bring it back?" And the boy, without hesitating, leaned across the desk and, looking into the eyes of the president, said, "Sir, as long as I live, I have to live with myself, and I don't want to live with a thief." Well, that was the story. Margaret didn't think the boy had even listened to it. But years later, she got a letter from him. He was now fighting on the war front in France. And he wrote in the letter, "Years ago, on a wet and rainy day when the ice was dangerous on the sidewalk, you came and told a story to a group of boys. I don't remember the details of the story, but I remember how it ended. As long as I live, I have to live with myself, and I don't want to live with a thief." He said, "That one story has kept me from lying and from stealing and from being a coward, and here in France it has kept me true to my manhood. I have a class of men in the barracks. I know that may be hard for you to believe, but some of my men need that story. In fact, I want it for all of them. For all that I am, I owe to that one story, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart." Now, one more story. This one Margaret included in the last chapter of her book, and she included it reluctantly. It wasn't that she hadn't shared it publicly, but it was always among friends, and it was very personal. But there was something that made her feel like she should include this in the book. She said that she had gone to a Sunday school class, and there was a group of boys that had been grilling their teachers. "Does anybody really know there's a God?" And he'd given all the Sunday school answers and just hadn't satisfied them. And she walked in and he said, "Can you do something to help?" And she looked at them. Their faces were eager and sincere. And she said, "Boys, I do know there's a God. And if you'll come back next week, I'll tell you why I know." So the next week, all the boys came back with some of their friends. And this is the story she proceeded to tell them. She said several years earlier, the doctor had told her that her father, as I understood it, was very, very ill, that she needed to take him out into the country where it was quiet, where they would be disturbed by nobody, and just take him out there to heal. She said that they took the little girl of 7, which I didn't know who that was. I thought maybe a sister or a little helper. And they went to a campsite on a lake in Maine where she had spent some summers previously, and they lived in a tent. And she said that the flowers were in full bloom. It was beautiful, and there were blackberries on the hillside. And the father seemed to be doing a little bit better. And then one day he took a turn for the worse. She called for the doctor from the nearest town 20 miles away, and he came and gave some medicine to give to the father, which she did. And he seemed to be doing a little bit better. And so they had all gone to bed that night. Well, late at night, she heard a rustling at the tent flap, and she opened it, and there was the doctor back again. He had hurried back. He said, "The blood work has shown that there's poison all through his system, and the medicine I've left you will not work. In fact, it could make him worse. I've come to bring you new medicine, and you need to administer it every 15 minutes. But even at that, this is very, very serious. He could be gone at any moment. And the doctor apologized. He said, I cannot stay. I've got other patients. And so Margaret stood at the tent flap and watched his lamp disappear into the forest. And she was all alone. She started administering the medicine every 15 minutes. And in between times, she tried to write letters, but her hands were shaking too bad. She tried to read, but she couldn't concentrate. After a couple of hours, she stood up and went back to the opening of the tent, and she braced herself on the pole with both hands to brace herself against the night breeze. And she looked out into the night, and she said for the first time in her life, she felt afraid, very, very afraid. The moon shone on the lake and reflected on the hills on the other side. And as she looked at the hills, the same words came to her mind that had come to the psalmist. I will lift mine eyes into the hills from whence cometh my help. My help is the Lord, creator of heaven and earth. The Lord is thy keeper. The Lord shall preserve thee. Again, the words came back. But this time she repeated them aloud. I will lift mine eyes into the hills from whence cometh my help. But this time as she spoke the words, a comfort and a strength completely filled her soul, and the fear vanished. It was gone, and she was strengthened and ready to face the hard things. She continued to give the medicine, and the morning broke, and death had passed them by. And she said to the boys, that's why I know there's a God. And they were satisfied. Well, remember I said that over the years I looked and looked. Every time I saw a small story book, I would look for my story of the pearls. A couple years ago, I was in a thrift store, and I found a book, and I opened it up, and finally, there it was. I was so excited that I just stood in the aisles, and I read the story of the pearls. And it was just like I remembered. But what I wasn't expecting, and what completely caught me by surprise, is at the end it said it was by Margaret Eggleston. My friend Margaret Eggleston. A short time after that, I was invited to our state girls' camp. They wanted me to come after dark when the girls were gathered around the campfire and tell them a story. You can guess what story it was that I told them. I told them the story of the strand of pearls. And again, it got me thinking about Margaret. And I thought, I wonder what other stories she's written. I wonder what I've missed. And I got online and I found that she had written another book after the first one called Fireside Stories to Tell to Teenage Girls. I opened it up and I looked at the table of contents. There was my story of the pearls. And I smiled at the coincidence that I had just told a story at a campfire to teenage girls that Margaret had written to tell at a campfire to teenage girls. Well, more time had gone by, and I continued to work on this project with my husband. And I had one of those moments where you kind of sit back and you reflect on where you've been, what you've done. By this time, we had filled nearly 60 volumes with stories of all sorts. In addition, I had selected and organized an online family library with over 2,000 additional books for families to access and use. I had spent months going through my notes, trying to put them in a way that I could share with you and with others what I had learned about warming and opening up the hearts of children. But above all, as I sat there and reflected, I thought how enriched my own life had become by spending so much time with these stories and with these storytellers. I had a measure of joy and hope come into my own life that I cannot even describe. And as I thought about it, I thought, Margaret, this was you. You're the one that opened the door. You're the one that introduced me to all your storytelling friends. I felt so grateful to her. I pulled her book off the shelf again that I hadn't read for several years, her use of story in religious education, and I started to read again. And as I read, this time, Having all the background of what I've learned, I appreciated with so much greater measure the depth of her wisdom and the goodness of her soul. And I just found myself saying, Margaret, who are you? What do you look like? So I got on the internet and I started searching, and I searched and searched and searched, and I couldn't find anything about her, only that she was born in 1878. So I told my husband how disappointed I was. And he suggested, he said, well, you know, they have a lot of public records available now. Maybe you can find something in the public records. And he helped me to look. Well, we didn't have much to go on, and I can tell you there are a lot of Margaret Egglestons out there. And I didn't know how I was going to find my Margaret Eggleston. So I went back to the book to look for some clues. And I found that on the title page it said she was a teacher at Boston University, and she dedicated the book to her little girl. So I thought, okay, we'll look for her in Boston. And at age 42, that probably was her only child, so we could narrow it down. And we found her in Boston. She was living with her widowed mother, Elizabeth White, who was 72 years old, and her little daughter, who was 13 years old. So I noted daughter was born in 1907. Well, what I was sad to learn was that Margaret also was a widow. Thought, what happened, Margaret? So we kept looking. We found her again on the 1910 census. Now she was living in Brooklyn, Kings County, New York. Her husband's name was Gurdon Eggleston. He was a clergyman, and they had their little girl of 3 years old. So now I knew I wanted to know what happened to Gurdon. I was looking for a death certificate between 1910 and 1920. We found one of a Gurdon Eggleston in 1914, but it said he died in Stoneham, Oxford. And I said to my husband, I don't think that's him because isn't Oxford in England? My husband said, hold on a second. And he came back and he said, no, Stoneham, Oxford is in Maine. I pulled out a map, and Oxford sits at the northern tip of a little lake in Maine, about 20 miles from the nearest city. When I had read the story earlier about her being at the camp, there was something that didn't fit right, but I couldn't figure out what it was. Now I understood what I had missed. She had worded it such so that you weren't sure who the people were, and she had referred to the father of her family. I thought it was her father. Now it suddenly hit me. This was the story of her husband, of her husband's illness. The little girl of 7 was their little girl. And now the story took on a much more personal connection to me, because my husband also had gone through a very serious illness. I knew well the fear that overtakes you in the middle of the night in those dark hours. And I too had felt the strength and comfort that comes from an outside source and gives you the strength to go on. But my husband got better. Now I learned Margaret had to say goodbye to hers. In the story, she said death had passed them by for a season, but evidently it hadn't passed by for very long, because he died in the middle of the summer, July 31st, 1914, just a little bit before his 36th birthday. The death certificate said he died of a cerebral hemorrhage from a brain tumor, and he was still a clergyman. Oh, Margaret, I thought, I'm so sorry. And then I thought, what else have I missed about her and her stories? So I went back to the fireside stories and I started reading again. And one of the first stories was about a young woman who goes to the doctor in the springtime, and the doctor says that your father is very ill. You need to take him out to a quiet place for him to get better. And she talks about the fear and going to the hills and being strengthened. And I thought, wait a minute, this is Margaret's story, but she's put the details. It's a cabin in New Hampshire. It's her father, but it's her story. And then I remembered what Margaret had told me about storytelling. The most effective, the stories that will make the deepest impressions are the ones that come from your own personal experience. And I thought, was it possible that this story of the Strand of the Pearls that I've carried for all these years, that I just thought was purely fictional, was based on true events in the life of this woman who had come to have so much influence on me? Now I wanted to put the story next to the facts that we could find in the public records and see if I could find evidence of that. Well, I found that Elizabeth White, her mother, had immigrated from England at the age of 22. I found a story in the Fireside book about a young woman, Elizabeth, who has come from far across the ocean. She's alone. The only job she can find is working in a factory. She's so poor she has to live in a boarding house. She's shunned by the rich people in the town, but she catches the eye of the favored and popular son who is attracted to her goodness. In the story of the pearls, it's said that the wealthy mill owner lived in eastern Pennsylvania. Margaret, and when the couple moved away to a small town, it was nearby. Well, Margaret was born in Walton, New York. It was a small town then, it's a small town now, and it lies just over the northeastern border of Pennsylvania. In the story, it talks about Mr. Morse moving far enough away that no one would know what had happened. And she talks about going to the lake with her friends. In the 1900 census, there's a little college town right by Oneida Lake, which lies about 100 miles north of Walton, New York. And in the 1900 census, there was the name of a college student there, Gurdon Eggleston. Now I found another story of a May with an M who's about to graduate from college. She has 3 young men who are pursuing her, and she can't decide which one to choose. Should she go with the rich one who will always make sure she has lots of money? Should she go with the football star who would always make her laugh? Or should she go with the scholar? She goes to a trusted professor and asks his opinion, and he counsels her, look at them through the eyes of who would make the best father to your children. She goes back to her apartment and she's thinking about this, and she sees the big bouquets of roses from her suitors, and then she notices a little lunchbox. She doesn't know who it's from, but she opens it up and it's full of forget-me-nots. She loves forget-me-nots. So she tucks some in her hair and she tucks them in her belt, and she takes off for the ceremony. Along the way, she runs into Jean with a G. And he says, oh, I see you got my flowers. He explains to her that he had left early in the morning. He wanted to go home to pick up his mother so that she could come back and meet her. And along the way, he noticed the forget-me-nots by the side of the road. And he knows that they're her favorite ones. And so he empties out his lunch and fills it full of flowers, puts it on the mail train that's going by, and hopes that it will get to her. Jean, she thinks. She met him in geology class. They had spent time out in the hillside, picking wildflowers and finding rocks. He was always so cheerful and so good-natured. And here he was with this little mother being so sweet to him. Jean, she thinks, I think I'll choose him. Now there's one more piece of evidence that I found. Margaret was issued a passport in 1921, and there was a picture of her in it. She's beautiful. And there was an affidavit in there that she needed to put in of someone that could vouch that they knew her, and it was signed by her mother, Elizabeth White. And if you looked at that signature, you would know that it was written by hand that wrote with great difficulty, which would have been explained by the story. Now, I cannot say for sure that the story is true. The evidence would make me think that it is, and somehow that just makes the story more meaningful to me. But as a side note, my husband loves to do family history, and he likes to see if people are related to him. And so he did a search to see if we had any ties to Gurdon Eggleston, and he found Gurdon's name in a family tree. Somebody had already put him in there. And my husband only had to go back a few generations until Gurdon's family line merged with one of my husband's family lines. But what was left blank on the record, because it was not known, was that Gurdon had a wife and a little girl. But it's not left blank anymore. As Margaret White Eggleston, almost 100 years from that sorrowful parting by a lake in Maine, the names of Margaret White Eggleston and Gurdon Eggleston have been reunited always and forever. Now, I realize you are here at a homeschool conference. You've come to learn maybe about curriculum. You're trying to find ideas how to teach your children. Why have I spent so much time telling you about Margaret Eggleston? Well, I have a lot of reasons for why I did it. First of all, I wanted you to feel the difference between a story and information. What if I had introduced Margaret to you this way? Margaret White was born in Walton, New York in 1878. She married Gurdon Eggleston, a clergyman, who died in 1914. In 1920, while teaching at Boston University, she wrote a book called The Use of Story in Religious Education. Would you have cared about her? Would you have any pictures of her in your mind? Would she have any personality? Did you notice how each story revealed another facet of her personality? The function of story is to stir feeling and awaken emotion. We use words like dry, cold, and hard to describe facts. But stories breathe life into them. Stories help us to care. They fire up desire and passion. If you find the right story, you can create an interest in any subject. Stories help us to see clearly and to understand things in our hearts that our eyes alone cannot comprehend and that facts alone cannot reveal. Stories are one of the most important tools you have to teach your children. My grown-up son recently finished a story through for the second time. It was Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. He was home when he finished reading it, and I was in the kitchen, and he came in and said, "I just finished reading Tale of Two Cities again." And he said, wow. Well, if you read a book like that, you know exactly what was going on. In the words of Alma, it was enlarging his heart, enlightening his mind, and it was tasting delicious to him. It was good fruit. The deeps of our souls, like the deeps of the ocean, are silent. And I didn't want to intrude on the work that was going on inside with just talking about it. So I just sat there and marveled at the power stories have to work on us, to make us wiser and better and thereby happier. Not all books have that power, though. What made this book different? And my answer to you is that it has everything to do with the heart through which the story flows. And I happen to know a little bit about the heart of Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens had a happy childhood, an idyllic childhood. He was a voracious reader, but that all came to an abrupt end when he was 11 years old. His father was thrown in debtor's prison, and Dickens was left to fend for himself and wander the streets until he ended up in a shoeblacking factory, where he worked in a rat-infested, tumble-down factory 10 hours a day, putting labels on shoeblacking. He said this was a horrible time of his life, when he experienced hunger, loneliness, poverty, and despair. As miserable as it was, the experience, though, enlarged his heart and gave him the capacity to tell a story like Tale of Two Cities. But there's another heart through which the stories pass through. Thomas Carlyle had been encouraged by his dear friend John Stuart Mills to write on the French Revolution. After 5 months of painful toil, he gave his one and only manuscript of Volume 1 to Mills for suggestions before sending it on to the publisher. When Carlyle didn't hear from his friends for several weeks, he went to visit his friend and found that the manuscript had been loaned out to another friend who had left it on the ground, and the housekeeper had used it to light the hearth fires. It was gone. Mills was absolutely beside himself with grief. He could think of no way to repair the damages, although he offered monetary compensation. To Carlyle's credit, he confided to his wife, Jane, "Mills, poor fellow, is terribly cut up. We must endeavor to hide from him how very serious this business of life is for us." And serious it was. The Carlyles were in desperate poverty. They'd hoped that this book was going to start paying for part of their bills. And Carlyle had destroyed all of his notes. He wrote, "I remember and can still remember less of it than anything I have ever written with such toil. It is gone." He had no hope of recovering it. But that night he had a dream in which his father and his brother appeared to him, and he begged them not to abandon the work. The next morning he accepted enough money to buy the paper, and he started writing again. At first he did volumes 2 and 3, and then he went back and recreated volume 1, writing the entire manuscript from memory using words, as Carlyle himself described, that came direct and flamingly from the heart. He said, "It is as if my invisible schoolmaster had torn my copybook when I showed it and said, 'No, boy, thou must write it better. The result was a masterpiece that has been in print to this day. He wrote as though he was a participant in all the events of the French Revolution, bringing it to life in such a way that the reader feels like he is there too. It was this work that Charles Dickens read and reread and that inspired him to write his Tale of Two Cities. My son simply had to pull the book off the shelf, open and read, and the souls and understanding of both Carlyle and Dickens poured into him. My son got to eat the fruit of the harvest made possible by someone else's hard labor. Thinking of that harvest got me thinking about the seasons. I'm not a historian, but I've read enough of history to see the cycles of the seasons go through the cycles of the nations. Those who are born in the springtime of nations are born at a time of new beginnings. The fields have to be cleared by chopping down trees and pulling out the stumps. Clods of dirt have to be broken up so that new furrows can be dug deep in the earth and so that seeds can be planted. Seedlings have to be gently watered and nourished so they can take root. Those who labor in the spring have their eye towards the harvest. Then comes the summer. Those who are born in the summertime get to bask in the sunshine and tend to fields that have already been planted. Their job is to tend the growing plants by pulling out the weeds and keeping an eye out for pests and disease. But they are still not the ones who get to eat the fruit of the harvest. Their eye is still on those who will come later. Happy and blessed are those who get to live in the time of the harvest, of autumn, the much anticipated time. They are the ones who get to eat the sweet, juicy, ripe fruit from the vines. While harvesters feast from the hard labor of those who came before, wise harvesters have their eyes on the coming winter because they know winter always follows autumn. They know if they preserve and store up a portion of the fruits of the harvest, they'll make it through the cold winter months when nothing grows. We are most definitely living in the days of the harvest, and what a harvest it is. There has never been one like it in all of recorded history. Just as the wisdom and experience of Carlyle and Dickens was preserved within the covers of a book my son only had to pull off a shelf and read, so has the wisdom and experience of all the ages been preserved and is now being made available to us in miraculous ways. A single book may contain an entire lifetime of someone's toil and effort. Today we're not limited to the narrow view of our own experiences. We can see and experience life through thousands of eyes, and history has preserved the best of the best for us. If you have an iPad, think about it. All the wisdom of the ages is preserved right there. You just pull it out. Our kids can have front row seats to the Bolshoi Ballet, to the Metropolitan Opera. Our kids can access any work of literature instantly. As they read it, if they come to a word that they don't understand, they just click. Here's the definition of it. We owe that to Webster, who spent his life learning 28 languages so he could take every word and dissect it and give us understanding. If they don't know where a place is, they just click. Here's a map. Here's a Google satellite. You can look at it. Everything, the best of the best, has been brought together to this little tablet that we have that our children can feast from. This is the day of the harvest. This is the day the fields are white and all ready to harvest. But we have a generation who don't have much desire to read. And that's where Margaret Eggleston comes in. Margaret Eggleston and her friends are heart specialists. They teach us how to warm and open up the hearts of our children. And beyond that, they left us a huge treasury of stories that we can use to teach our children and to open their hearts. They gave us the fairy tales. You know, the fairy tales have come through hundreds and thousands of years. We need fairy tales because they are wrapped around moral truths delivered in a way that a child's heart can understand. We need fairy tales because they light our imagination. We can't dream, we can't envision things if we don't have an imagination. Einstein said, if you want your children to be intelligent, read them fairy tales. If you want them to be more intelligent, read them more fairy tales. The storytellers preserved them. Had they not done what they did when they did, they would have been gone. They gave us stories to help us understand art and music. They gave us stories to of the great literature, to draw our children to literature, but above all, they gave us the stories of history. No one is writing history for our children anymore, except for the textbook writers, and our children are not getting anything to care about history from that. The storytellers were scholars. They saw it with their eyes, and they related to our children so that they could feel like they are there. They brought all the great men and women of history to life, just as I used stories to bring Margaret Eggleston to life. They brought the great men and women to life of history. These men and women can be an influence and be a very real friend to your children if you will tell the stories and not just the facts and the information. Two more minutes. I think we started a little bit late, and I'm trying to put this together. All their stories were wrapped in love. Throughout the books you hear them say, "Dearest boys and girls, I love you, your affectionate friend, your loving friend," and your children will feel the warmth of the stories. This is the day of the harvest. Already I see signs of approaching winter. The leaves are changing colors and are starting to drop off the trees. There's a chill in the air, but we don't have to be afraid of winter. Within the harvest are the lessons on how to survive harsh winters. And if we're wise in the time of the harvest, we will store up and preserve enough to see us through the months when nothing grows. Winter can be a time of resting from heavy labors, of wrapping up in a warm blanket by the fire and reflecting on those things that really matter. And even on the very coldest day of winter is found great beauty. Some of the greatest masterpieces of literature, fine art, and music have come from history's winters. And should the days become especially dark and lonely and dreary, we'll hold on to the hope and promise of spring, because spring always follows winter, always, and it will be a time of new beginnings. It will be a time of clearing away rotting leaves and digging new furrows in the earth and planting the seeds that we saved from the fruits of fall. And there will be fresh scented breezes. I know that the harvesters may be few. They are in your home. This is your privilege to be able to open up their hearts so that they will take advantage of all that has been given to them. I know the number may be small, it always is, but I've baked enough bread to know that a little bit of leaven will raise the whole loaf. Long ago and far away, I listened to a story about a strand of pearls. That story has lifted me up and changed my life forever. Lifting up and changing lives is the power of a story. Stories can heal our nation. Stories can heal the world. Don't underestimate the power of a story.